Hey guys, this is Dominic. I wanted to do a video for people who might be new to 4-panel dance games like In the Groove. This video is just going to be a little bit of a roundup of the different options that are available out there for somebody who wants to buy a home pad, at least at this moment in time in 2020. So one thing to keep in mind before we get started is your requirements for a pad might be very different from mine or really any other In the Groove player. I myself play Stamina, which is long, usually unbroken streams of content that's somewhat relatively fast. But if you're an FA player who's playing for accuracy, or a tech player who's playing, technical types of charts, or a casual player who really doesn't care about the high levels of play and the ability to upgrade your pad in the future, you might not have to worry about a lot of the things that like a stamina or a foot speed player might have to worry about. But also keep that in mind when you're reading other people's reviews, especially if they're scathing. It might not work well for one type of play, but for another it might work very well. But that said, I'm a stamina player, so I value the stamina things more highly. And I also haven't used every one of these options. I've only used a few of them. So I had to do my best in, reading Reddit posts and talking to different people who own them. And in some cases, I couldn't find anyone who owns any of these pads, but I still wanted to mention them. So this isn't really a review. It's just kind of like these are the options or things that are available to you or not available to you. So when discussing each pad, I have some subjective measurements that I just kind of came up with on my own. So you can kind of judge, at least in how pads compare to each other, which is better or worse in that area. So the first thing I have is the cost, which may be used, may also include shipping to the US, so take that with a grain of salt. Availability, which is how easy it is to get your hands on one of these pads. The setup and maintenance, whether it's very difficult to get going, you have to build the pad, or if it's tricky or hard to maintain going forward. The performance that you can expect from the pad. Really, this is geared towards stamina play, but it certainly might apply to other play styles as well. Whether or not the pad has a bar, or if it's an upgradable option. Lights in the panels, not just for looking pretty, but they're also very helpful for debugging sensitivity and seeing if you actually are pressing enough. And then there's the sensors. There's 4 main categories. Metal contacts, which are just 2 pieces of metal that touch together to bridge an electrical connection. There's arcade sensors, which are kind of like a rubber membrane with an air pocket inside that touch together to make a connection. There's load cells, and then there's FSRs. FSR stands for Force Sensitive Resistor. I really don't have much experience with load cells or FSRs, although I've used pads with both types of sensors for a little while. Both of these sensor technologies are relatively new to dance games, but FSRs seem to be cheaper, more ubiquitous, and easier to use. One of the pads we'll talk about, StepmaniaX, was the only production pad with load cells, and they later changed to FSRs in future generations. The SMX implementation of load cells posed some problems for stamina players, as it needed to recalibrate during gameplay. In general, FSRs and arcade sensors are preferred, at least in the stamina community at this point in time. And finally, how difficult is it to upgrade this pad to FSRs if it doesn't have FSRs already? This is a really common thing that we're seeing in home pads, especially because finding original sensors or replacement parts is very difficult, so you can kind of take an old pad and retrofit it. It's not really as easy in all pads to do that retrofitting. So our first pad is the soft pad. I'm sure that everybody has owned one of these at some point in their lives. They are complete trash and they are completely useless in my opinion. Anyone who has one of these has dealt with them moving around, sliding under your feet while you're playing a song. Absolutely no way to feel where your feet are on the notes. They might be okay for the most basic beginner, but for anyone who's serious or really wants to play this as a hobby, you're not going to want to play with one of these very long. The cost is great. It's really cheap. You can probably go find one in a dumpster right now for free. The availability is excellent. Setup and maintenance is excellent as well. There's really nothing you need to do. You just have to plug it in, and as long as it has the port, it'll work. The performance is about as low as it can go while still be working. The sensors are metallic contacts. There is no bar. There are no lights. And as far as retrofitting FSRs, there's really no reason to. You might as well just use a piece of plywood, in my opinion. The Legacy hard pad is really a collection of pads that have come out over the years and really aren't being made anymore. These are pads like the Cobalt Flux, Ion Pro, DDR Game, and Blue Shark. I'm really lumping together any old hard pad into this group. I think this is really like the entry-level pad for somebody who wants to get into 4-panel dance games as a hobby. They're relatively cheap. You might be able to pick one up for, less than $100, all the way up to $300 or $400 if you're getting like a nicer Cobalt Flux. So the availability is pretty good. You can find them around. They change hands used on the buy-sell trade group a lot. The setup and maintenance for these is kind of tough. Because they're not manufactured anymore, you can't really get parts for them. Furthermore, because they use metal contacts and they aren't the most sensitive things in the world, people have taken to do something called penny modding, which is when you take actual literal pennies and you put them in between the sensor contacts to help make the pads more sensitive. The downside is that over time, this can really kind of chew into that soft metal that's used in some of these pads. So this can result in the metal contacts actually wearing out and breaking. Overall, the performance is usable, especially if you don't mind taking a little bit of a hit on your lifespan of your sensors and doing the penny mod. They sometimes come with a bar, although that seems to be pretty rare. There are no lights, and they're actually able to be upgraded to FSRs without too much effort. Nitty's is a great example of a top stamina player who is using a Blue Shark that has been modified to use FSRs. One thing that all these pads have in common is that the build quality just really isn't that good. They're all made of crappy wood, they use kind of flimsy metal trim, and the panels are very thin. You really might have to baby these a lot more than some other pads. Next up are the LTEKs, also called Polish pads. They really are very similar to a good legacy home pad, like the Cobalt Flux. They ship from Europe, so shipping and currency conversion included, it's roughly $300 if you're in the United States. It's a great option as far as pads you can buy new, but some people have complained about the buying process being slow or confusing, and the product getting damaged in shipping. Setup is pretty easy, but most stamina players end up penny modding these pads as well, as they also have metal contacts for sensors. LTEKs suffer from a polling issue, which impacts players who are focused on accuracy. There doesn't seem to be a software fix for this, but some have modified their LTEKs to use an Arduino for input to poll at a faster rate. There are no panel lights, but they do sell a bar for the LTEK, but some have complained about it wobbling and being in a different position than DDR bars. Some LTEK owners build their own bar. Upgrading to FSRs is doable, and doing so bypasses the polling rate issue. Yutzi is a stamina player who uses an FSR modified LTEK. Overall, it's a good option for someone who wants a new pad, and probably what I'd recommend to a friend if they were on a budget and weren't technically savvy. Precision dance pads have been around for a while. They're constructed as a piece of wood with a plastic layer that sits on top of it, separated by some foam spacers. They are currently priced at $375 before shipping. The availability is poor because they seem to be made in batches. You'll need to text some guy to get on a wait list for them. On the plus side, you can customize them in a bunch of unique ways. They are easy to get set up, and due to their construction, there isn't much you'll need to do to maintain them. Their performance is poor. They have a thin, foil-like contact sensor. I think you're really going to have a bad experience on these pads trying to do anything high level for stamina. Enrique is a stamina player who plays on a precision dance pad, but she modified it heavily to be more sensitive, and it sounded like quite the challenge. These aren't easy to modify, and there's a lot of risk of breaking them by doing so. If you found a deal on a used precision dance pad and are a casual player who wants something easy to store away in a small apartment, you might be happy with it. Otherwise, I don't think it's a good option for high-level play. With FSRs becoming more available and more people converting their pads to FSRs, a new type of pad has become more popular in the last year or so, the travel pad. They're called travel pads because they're so small you could travel around with them. But the small size and resources available make them relatively easy and cheap to make. I mean, if you slap an Arduino, a breadboard, and some sensors on a piece of wood, with a bit of tweaking, you've got yourself a pad. FSR use in the Stepmania community is really growing. New resources are getting created every day, resources like step-by-step guides, codebases, and schematics. A central hub for the making of these pads is the Pads channel in Stepmania Nation. If you're wondering where to start, I'd head there and read the pins. Although the resources are great, you do have to do everything yourself, so setup and maintenance is poor versus a pad you could just buy. What's surprising to me is how well these perform. Considering how janky many of these look, they are a real contender that can support high-level play. UVCat is a top Stepmania player who played on a Dedicab at school, but after he left his campus due to COVID, he built a travel pad he has now passed 25s on. If you're on a budget, are technically savvy, or just want a fun project to work on, building a travel pad is a great way to go about it. With enough trial and error, you can get something that performs very well for a fraction of the cost of other home pad options. It is above and beyond the best bang for buck option out there. Personally, I hope someone in the future manufactures pads like these and puts them up for sale, for those of us who don't have the tools or time to do so. Ahle is a member of Stepmania Nation who has been working on a high-quality travel pad, built for manufacturing. It is the most sturdy and professional pad we've seen to date, but it's still in the early stages, and Ahle is the only person with working prototypes, so there isn't availability at this point in time. The pad uses FSRs, has no lights, and doesn't have a bar. You won't be able to buy one of these pads already made, at least not from him. When the project is ready, you could get a few friends together and do a group purchase of 10 of them. The parts would be manufactured in bulk, and then you could assemble them yourself. The cost is still being figured out, but since the parts are manufactured to order, buying in volume reduces the price. Ahle told me that they paid $1,000 for each of their prototypes, but buying 10 could bring it down to $500 each, and 20 to $350 each. This project has a lot of potential. It's something I'll definitely be keeping my eye on. A Brazilian company called DanceFit makes a 4-panel pad that optionally comes with a bar. I know very little about this company or the pad, but it appears to be made from MDF and uses contact sensors. If you have one of these pads, let me know in the comments if it worked out for you. If you're interested in pursuing one of these, keep in mind taxes and shipping from Brazil can get quite expensive for Americans. LTEK is another company which makes a pad that I know very little about. I think they're from South America. A lot of people dislike them because they've spammed the buy-sell-trade Facebook group in the past. A few folks have reported that they are slow to process orders as well. I could only find one review of these pads, and they don't seem very good. The seller claims that they use FSRs, but the reviewer describes something more akin to metal contacts. A LTEK pad costs about $520 with a bar before shipping. At that price and the apparent quality, I really don't think anyone would recommend this pad. I have to level with you. I have no idea what these pads are called. A guy on Facebook sells these and he posts his videos to a Chinese website called Bilibili. He appears to be using aftermarket easy-to-dancer arcade sensors, which I know very little about. I also know very little about these pads, but he seems to make a bunch of different styles. One version he sells is a 4-panel pad on one side, and when flipped over, reveals a 5-panel pump-it-up pad. At almost $900 shipped, this really isn't a cheap option, especially since so little is known about their performance. Impulse pads are famous for cock-teasing the entire dance game community for years. It was originally a project started by Brittany, but eventually transitioned to Matt and Laura, who are developing a 9-panel game called Rhythm Horizon. Recently, it was announced the target was $500, and it wouldn't have a bar or lights. Impulse is designed to be a 9-panel pad which uses load cells, but thinner ones than were used on SMX. Another detail which surfaced was the panels on Impulse pads were slightly smaller than the arcade pads, since that would allow them to fit more panels on one sheet, keeping costs down. Very recently, it was announced that Impulse is dead, and a completely new product, Rhythm Horizon Platforms, would take its place. Apparently, any previous updates or announcements made for Impulse platforms will no longer apply. So we really don't know anything about this pad going forward. Personally, I think the pad will be similar to what we've been hearing. A 9-panel load cell pad with slightly smaller panels, no bar, and no lights, for a target price of at least $500. I think this pad has a lot of promise. Matt and Laura are not only great dance game players, but they are incredibly smart people who have been building what appears to be a great game. Since Rhythm Horizon is a 9-panel game, and there are so few options for 9-panel home pads, they really need this pad to be successful if they want their game to succeed too. That gives me hope that this pad will eventually come out and will be great when it does. But for now, all this pad is a source of dank memes. Brittany, who originally started Impulse, started an open source pad project called Reflex Pads, after Impulse shifted to Matt and Laura. Reflex is a 4-panel pad with optional bar and lights which also uses load cells, likely similar to those in Impulse. Like Ahle's travel pad, Reflex is a pad you build yourself. Reflex uses more pre-existing parts compared to Ahle's though. The current price targets are $700 with a bar and lights, or $450 without. I'm looking forward to seeing these become available too. StepmaniaX is made by the same person behind In the Groove, Kyle Ward. There is a standalone pad and a dedicated cabinet for the 5-panel StepmaniaX game, but the pads are often used to play ITG as well. If you want to play StepmaniaX for some reason, you'd have to buy a Dedicab, as it's not available to the standalone pad purchasers. The pads can be upgraded to 4-panel, Pump It Up 5-panel, or 9-panel with pre-made kits. In general, the pads are sturdy and are similar in construction to arcade pads. They are great looking pads in general, with plenty of lights in the panels and under the pad as well. SMX pads have changed slightly over time. Generations 1 through 3 use load cells, while Generation 4 and onward use FSRs. You can usually identify a Gen 3 or older because it has panels with holes, underneath of which is a taped-on plastic panel, which easily collects dust and grime. Obviously, for stamina play, having a bunch of holes in your center panel where you're trying to reduce friction on is a bad idea. Stamina players usually either switch to using the acrylic center panel or purchasing an optional solid metal center panel, which Kyle makes available. A lot of Gen 3 and older SMX players have trouble using their pads for stamina, mostly because making the up arrow sensitive enough requires some tricky modding. Some even convert the up arrow to an FSR. Additionally, some of the older generations have some annoying quality problems, like USB ports that are too loose or electronics that are very sensitive to power quality. I had a Gen 3 SMX pad for a few months, and I couldn't really get it comfortable for stamina play. It was, however, excellent for slower stuff, where I stepped more directly. The panels felt a bit more mushy than normal arcade pads. All generations of SMX pads auto-recalibrate. This means, while you're playing a song, the sensors could alter their values. But someone in the community has a software fix that can bypass this issue, only for generations 4 and above. H-Saurus is a stamina player who originally had a Gen 3, but later upgraded to a Gen 4. He does very well on his SMX, but like many other SMX players, he has trouble leaving decents and way-offs enabled. All SMX pads have what I consider is the most comfortable bar of any dance game. The bar is wide and symmetrical and incredibly sturdy. Anyone with an SMX pad doesn't have to worry about a bar ever cracking a weld like other arcade pads. At this point in time, SMX pads are sold in batches. If you want a new one, you'd have to follow Kyle's Facebook pages and wait for an update. And when he makes the post, you'd frantically try to buy one as fast as possible. The last batch of pads sold out in seconds. It seems he can't make them fast enough, but some part of me wonders if this is like the line outside of a nightclub. The fact that they are scarce and there's drama around getting one, it attracts more attention and more people line up. At roughly $1,800 shipped to the US for one pad, these aren't cheap. But if you have the dough, want something nice, and are going to mostly play FA, tech, casual stuff, or overall, you don't mind disabling decents and way offs, I think you'll probably love this pad. If your goal is stamina or foot speed, you might have to consider it more carefully. Dance Dance Revolution arcade pads are the real deal. They are built to withstand a decade of abuse in public arcades, but many DDR machines have made their way into private ownership over the years. Not all DDR pads are created equal though. They've had different generations over the years, and even within the same generations, they've had different manufacturers. If you're planning on buying a DDR machine for Stepmania, you probably are not going to consider one of the newer ones, like white or red cabinets. Of the older DDR machine styles, they have machines made in Japan, J-cabs, machines made in Korea, K-cabs, Namco cabs, also called Crapo cabs because they have a reputation for being crappy, and some other variants like DDR Solo. J-cabs are more sought after, but apart from some shoddy wiring and some K-cabs, they seem fine to me. If you plan on using existing arcade sensors, I'd steer clear of Solo pads though, as they have less sensors per panel than typical arcade pads. Another cab type I'd watch out for as the notoriously shitty Raw Thrills DDR pad. An easy way to spot these is the metal trim that covers the usually exposed panel brackets. For any type of arcade pads, there's really two ways to go about it. You can buy a complete machine, meaning pads and the cabinet, or you can sometimes buy just the pad. Older DDR cabs go for between $800 and $2,500, while pads seem to go for around $400 to $500 per side. If you have the cab, you can sometimes use the input device that comes with it for Stepmania. Otherwise, or if you only have a pad, you can use a device like the Get.io for input, which will allow you to use your existing sensors over USB. Not only is owning a full cabinet expensive and takes up space, it's a massive maintenance headache as well. A lot of the more difficult to replace repair parts, like the CRT monitor and neons, are in the cabinet. When someone asks me if they should buy a cab, this is usually our exchange.
I'm not afraid.
You will be. You will be.
Buying an individual pad or set of pads without a cab is an excellent option, if you can find one. There's a big demand for DDR pads, and while DDR machines are easy to come by, they are more rarely sold without the cabinet. I often see people recommending, just buy a DDR pad for $400. If only it were always that easy. If you're interested in DDR pads alone, you may want to consider buying a cheap DDR machine, taking a pad, parting out the cab, and selling the other pad. DDR pads are constructed well, but you can expect a used one to be full of dirt, grime, and have some rust. The bars are sturdy, but thinner than Pump It Up or SMX bars, which seems to suit shorter players better. Some people replace their DDR bars with Pump It Up ones for this reason. DDR arcade pads are very similar in construction to ITG Dedicab pads, which we'll talk about next, but all of this also applies to ITG as well. Arcade pads are straightforward to mod. Usually you add some Gorilla Tape on top of the L bracket until your panel is at the right height. If you want to make a sensor more sensitive, you can put some tape under the L bracket. Arcade sensors are somewhat expensive, at around $10 per sensor before shipping. Remember, there's 4 sensors per panel and 4 panels per pad. But in a private setting, arcade sensors last a lifetime. If you want to upgrade to FSRs instead, it's an incredibly easy and non-destructive upgrade. There's plenty of room inside for wiring and the Arduino, and you simply put the FSR on top of the L bracket. Overall, an arcade pad is excellent for any type of play, but it's not uncommon to see people prefer modding setups for one style or another. As an example, having one side for stamina and one side for FA. Levitas is arguably the top ITG stamina player at this point in time, and he uses a DDR pad with arcade sensors. I say, grab one if you can get it for the right price, but unless you get lucky, you might be waiting longer than you'd think. Pads from the In the Groove dedicated cabinet, Dedicab for short, are some of the most sought-after dance pads. They are scarce, and it's even rarer to see an individual pad sold without a cabinet, let alone a cabinet for sale at all. ITG machines sell for upwards of $6,500, but usually go for around $4,000. A pad sold on its own might go for $1,000. As I said before, the pad itself is constructed very similarly to DDR pads, but instead of sharing parts with DDR, it uses slightly different parts which are shared with older pump-it-up pads. If you want to use an ITG pad with arcade sensors over USB, instead of the Get I/O, you'd use another device called the Bar I/O. Of course, upgrading to FSRs is just as easy as with a DDR pad. If you thought owning a DDR cabinet was a maintenance headache, a Dedicab is far worse. Many parts on the Dedicabs aren't made anymore. You won't find a real set of replacement ITG panels, for example, but you can for DDR. Dedicabs have a beautiful, large, flat-screen Cortex CRT, which have a bad habit of shitting themselves. Dedicabs have wide, offset bars, similar to Pump It Up, but even within Dedicabs, there are a couple different bar variants. Unfortunately, like Pump It Up bars, they seem to easily crack welds near the base, requiring welding or replacement if they take some abuse. Overall, if you're buying a Dedicab or an ITG pad, a lot of what you're paying for is nostalgia and collector value. It's neat to own a part of ITG history. I think ITG cabs are much nicer than DDR cabs of the same age, but when it comes to the pads themselves, there's not much of a difference, other than price and ease of buying replacement parts. Congratulations! You made it through 25 minutes of Dominic's opinions. No doubt I've made some mistakes, left stuff out, or had some bad takes. Feel free to just fuck my shit up in the comments. With what's going on in the world right now, being able to play a fitness game like ITG in your own home is a pretty important thing. Many arcades have shut down, yet the community seems to be thriving, as it seems dance gamers are almost more connected online than they were before. Many of these options we discussed were very expensive, but I'd argue, so is a treadmill, so is a gym membership, so is buying some shitty $60 console game every month. The world of ITG is full of amazing content. There are so many play styles, packs of songs, tournaments, and communities. The best part? It's free. The cost of entry is a pad and a computer. You'll have a lifetime of gameplay ahead of you that you'll likely never master. In some ways, I think it's a better investment than a treadmill you'll never use, or a game you'll only play for 20 hours and put away.